Hi, everyone. We're definitely not experts. We've got a lot to learn, and we're learning every day. Even during the preparation for this Khana Brown Bag launch, there's a lot we learned. I'm Ruchira. I'm the project director of Sapna South Asian Climate Solidarity. I'm based on the lands of the Ruchira people in Melbourne, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. It always will be Aboriginal land. I am, although presently in India, and I have been here for the last 1 year for Sapna's work, focusing on bringing stories from the ground in South Asia. So I'm joining you very early in the morning. Sadiya will quickly introduce herself before she begins, but I just really quickly want to say it's great to be back in a Khana Brown Bag lunch after 2 years. We presented, there was a joint panel with some others from Australia, and we presented on India and how we interpret India's actions and messages during COP 2 years ago. And very happy to be able to bring Bangladesh again, another country. And before I pass on to Sadiya in exactly a minute, I just want to say that this was a real test for us in understanding how we come from so many of us come from such different places of relative ease or difficulty to make the same presentation be in the same space. I really want to acknowledge Sadiya, who is a Sapna community member and has been with Sapna in the network, in the social network, right from the very beginning. We receive very less news in Australia about what's going on in Bangladesh, what the situation has been, also with the floods, but also the political situation. And Sadiya is finishing a fantastic PhD, and she's constantly thinking about what's going on back home and with her family too. And she's holding it all together, and she'll be presenting today. So I just want to acknowledge the work that people come in and do in Sapna, and because of which we can have this conversation with you today. And over to you, Sadiya.
Thanks, Ruchira, for this very warm welcome. And my name is Sadiya Binte Karim. I'm currently in Newcastle, Mulunbinba, the unceded land of Abekal and Warmai people. And before I start, I want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And at a time when we are talking about, I'm about to present about my homeland and the political turmoil that recently happened, but also the back-to-back disaster that constantly battered my homeland. It's more evident than ever while doing this work, sitting in an unceded colonized land, and how the history of ongoing colonization impact these lands across the world. For my day job, as Ruchira said, I don't know if it's going to be fantastic or not, but I am currently doing my PhD on the climate justice negotiations that happens within Australian movement from University of Newcastle. And for this specific report, I'm trying to kind of summarize the already built up work on the climate justice leadership that Bangladesh has been showing from the very beginning of the negotiations that's happened at a global scale. Bangladesh, or as we call it, Desh, my motherland, has always been at the forefront of different kind of disaster and how it impacts and shapes the political situations across. But it's also at the forefront of showing leadership in terms of what a climate just world should look like and where the world should head. I will share my screen. This is an ongoing research project that I'm doing with Ruchira. I really appreciate the vision she's bringing South Asian stories to the Australian climate movement and the relentless work she has been doing to keep Sapna going. And it has been an incredible opportunity to work with her throughout this project. And despite all the difficulties and all the worlds that we juggle, I welcome you all to this presentation. I will share my presentation in a bit. 1 second. Okay. Can everyone see it? Okay. So when you think about Bangladesh's recent thing, I think you heard about the recent student protest that's happened, and that kind of changed the political dynamics of the country, but also the recent flood that happened, where millions of people have remained stranded for months. And that's embedded. Even though it's quite unimaginable to think those situations together when the country goes through such a big political turmoil, and then you have back-to-back landslide and floods. But this is the reality of climate change in Bangladesh. And just to think about that, when the country is going through so much politically turmoil situation, and then you get hit by a flood that can strand 1 to 2 million people, how that settles in our mind and our everyday life. So for the climate justice profiling, I want to start with, so my home country, Bangladesh, is one of the most populous country in the world with 173 million people, and 28% of them are the youth of Bangladesh. But despite this huge population, Bangladesh contributes very least to the climate change that it batters its everyday life. Bangladesh's the coastal population, just to give an understanding of the population dynamics of Bangladesh, around 20% of our population, that's 35%, lives in the coastal areas. And Bangladesh, mostly the 40% of the Bangladeshis lives in cities and 60% are the villagers. And most of it's an agriculture-based economy, and people, they're mostly go their day-to-day living by for agriculture and farming and fishing. It's their main occupation. The youth population is around 28%. But the interesting thing is, when you see 173 million people and a quite densely population, looking at the carbon emission, Bangladesh contributes only 0.3% towards global emission. It's 146th on the global list of carbon emission. But then the juxtaposition when we see at the extreme weather events, when we look at it, in between the last 20 years, this was quite shocking for me and Ruchira as well, just to look at the sheer scale. We know it's an every other day, there is a cyclone, there is a flood, but then the sheer scale of extreme weather events, just in between the last 20 years, Bangladesh experienced around 185 extreme weather events, and this includes Category 5 level of tropical cyclones, flash floods, heat waves, and droughts in the northern area as well. According to the International Climate Change and Development Agency, every year it's almost causing Bangladesh millions and millions of dollars, but also it's the loss of agricultural land, the farming land. But more than the financial losses and the losses of livelihoods, it's also putting people under so much stress about their everyday living. Imagine a flood happening and so devastating that you lose your everything behind, and then you go back. How many times can you rebuild your life if it's a constant recurring event? Just within 20 years, 185 extreme weather events. And people reach to a breaking point where it's how many times can you build your life? If we look at this, it's quite odd to constantly talk about data where it's more than data. When we say Dhaka, which is the capital of the country, there's been recent statistics shows that every day around 2,000 people migrate to Dhaka for their livelihood, and around 70% of them are actually climate refugees who are internally displaced. And the people who used to live around the coastal areas or otherwise impacted by climate change, they had to pack up their entire life and move to a city that is already congested. So how that impacts their livelihood, their living standards, their connection to family, their connection to land is something to think about. And considering all these dire situations, the Global Climate Risks Index articulate that Bangladesh is the 7th most vulnerable countries in the world, considering the long-term impact that Bangladesh faces. And even in the 6th latest IPCC assessment, it's mentioned 430 times. So if we think about all this data and overwhelming, we're still working on these reports, but how it's impact the health of women who live in the coastal areas, how it impact children, how it impacts communities, their livelihoods, their sense of security. It's constantly all I'm trying to impose here that when we think about the impact of climate change as a future for us in Bangladesh, it's a reality, and we have been living with it in our everyday life for quite some time now, despite contributing very little to this crisis. It's not a future 5-year, 10-year that's going to impact us. It's impacting how women manage their reproductive health, how children, how the family decides if they will be able to send their kids to school or not, if there will be any school to go as well. So these are very everyday life implication that puts Bangladesh at the center of what climate injustice looks like. This is ongoing many disasters that Bangladesh go through and impacts, including what I mentioned earlier, cyclones, water salination, river erosion, heat wave. What we tried to do here with that, tried to create a timeline of just the cyclones, just to give you an understanding what it looks like. So from the 1970s to 2004, we kind of, sorry about that, cataloged all the cyclones and the number of lives that has been lost. I want to start with the Bhola cyclone, which was just before the independence year of Bangladesh. Bhola cyclone was quite crucial for us because it showed us how a disaster battered entire country's political dynamics as well. What happened during the Bhola cyclone in the 1970s, and at that time Bangladesh is known as East Pakistan, and the lack of support from the West Pakistan government and relief end up leading to a death of 300,000 people. And that really changed the political dynamics, and later the revolution that happened and our liberation war that led to our independence in 1971 as well. But since 1971, Bangladesh's independence, from 1971 to 2023, as even recent one, like as we are giving this presentation, recently Cyclone Dana, Bangladesh, some of the coastal areas got heavy rainfall, but it we dodged one bullet there, but who knew in the next one? Especially, I think if I'm talking about my own personal experience, 2007, that Cyclone Cedar, I was just finishing school, and then in a cyclone shelter, it's just not just numbers and back to back, like, oh, so many cyclones happens in Bangladesh, these hectares of land losses, this number of people died. Just to one precise example that still, I think, kind of stays with me and kind of keeps motivating me to go through this process is Cyclone Cedar. And at that time, I was in Dhaka, but most of my maternal side of the family lives in the coastal area. So we get to see the firsthand impact and how everyone had to pack up their stuff and go to the cyclone shelter. And in those cyclone shelters, there is, as you have to deal with providing support for the elderly population, there's also pregnant women. And in each one of those, what happens to the newborn babies? How do you shift? And that Cyclone Cedar, there was in Dublarchor area, which is another Dublarchor area, there was a kid born, and the mother very hopefully named her son Cedar. At that time, it felt like, and when the journalists go and ask her, why you want to name your son after a cyclone? And she was like, oh, maybe because he fought against this cyclone to came to this world. It was very grim, but also at the same time, a hope of a mother that was very hopeful. Coming back to it, the hope that Bangladeshi women and the resilience of Bangladeshi people that they hold kind of gets battered when, despite contributing very less, we constantly get battered by the crisis. Is each of these cyclone 2009, 2020, and to the latest 2023 one, there are so many babies born, and many of the mothers keep, especially 2019, that's an interesting one. Again, the story came up. Another mom, this time, named her daughter, who born in the cyclone center, Bulbul. Bulbul is also a bird, bulbuli, which is a bird in Bengal. Um, and when the journalist again asked her, she was like, "Oh, she fought against it, so we named as a hope." But how many cyclones, how many disasters can a community and a country altogether can face and keep the hopes on going? That's the story. It's again this immense resilience that keeps coming from the ground, people's resilience, they keep building their life together. But it's also to the point of you get overwhelmed when you have to constantly under the pressure of rebuilding your life. Now I'm going to quickly brief at so Bangladesh has been aware of these situations that we didn't cross because of the embedded indigenous knowledge that the country produced and the community-led adaptation. Bangladesh has been a leader of climate justice advocacy and forcing the global north to pay for climate reparations from the very beginning. The person you see on the screen, Professor Salimul Haq, has been a world-renowned climate scientist who has attended all the COPs from the very beginning till the day he passed last year. Just 2 days ago, it was his death anniversary. And while I do this presentation, I want to pay my respect to his relentless work and all the local community that worked alongside with him and the people around him. And the loss and damage leadership that Bangladesh from the very earlier days knew that it is beyond our control, no matter how much local-led adaptation we develop. We didn't cause this crisis, and it's the financial impact, the community-based impact is gonna overwhelm us. And there should be talk about loss and damages that are done by the Western nations like Australia, like the US and Canada, but also so we deserve our reparation. It's not some aid to be given because it's a donation, it's our right for the damages that's done to us. So here we are working on kind of creating a timeline of all the COPs that Bangladesh has attended and relentlessly advocated for. I just want to point out few areas. Bangladesh was from the very beginning a key advocate of actually emancipating the idea of climate vulnerable forum in the 2009, and then advocate for grassroots and this local-led adaptation concept that we are very aware how to lead our community, how to build that adaptation and resilience, but also at the same time, the financial need or the reparations money should come to Bangladesh, and then the community should decide how they're gonna build their adaptation capacity. And from the Montreal 2005 to the Copenhagen to the Warsaw, the buildup of the Warsaw Convention, Bangladesh has relentlessly talked about the need for a loss and damage fund for the Global South community. And I think in 1991, if we consider its connection to the Pacific, when Vanuatu for the first time bring up the idea of loss and damage, and from then in 2009 during Copenhagen, Bangladesh was also one of the countries to push that it is beyond our Pacific Island neighbors also. It's also the South Asian neighbors and other countries across the world. So it's a global South issue rather than just the small island nations. Finally, we see some action happening in the 2022 COP that finally there is agreements around a loss and damage fund. And these are also other areas in terms of what I earlier mentioned about different local-led adaptation. Earlier, when I was showing that cyclone timeline, the number of death has increased because of different local-led adaptation that built up by the community knowledge. But then Bangladesh also have been working with other small island nations and other communities, climate vulnerable forums as well, to constantly build up their capacity. Almost in the end of my presentation, Ruchira, would you like to show the last slide? So I'm kind of trying to sum up this entire situation with a personal story again that's often gets quite tricky to share. And that was the 2020 cyclone Ampan. I was in Newcastle, and 2020 just had 2019 bushfire, Black Summer bushfire, and then the COVID pandemic just at the very beginning of my PhD journey. And then 2020 cyclone Ampan hit Bengal. And that's when I lost my grandmother during the cyclone. The story, she has been sick for a long time. We were expecting it, but not during a cyclone. And I'm not saying that the very vulnerable position, not having the proper support. We had everything, the nebulizer that needed to support her, the other healthcare facilities. But at that cyclone was so massive, even with the financial and logistical support that we have put together for her, that wasn't enough because we couldn't take her to the hospital at that time. Everyone had to get stuck in the home. So no matter how much prevention or adaptation measures, it's just one family. When we think about this, and I think it's an ethical dilemma as well, talking about numbers and everything constantly. Just this 1,000 people died, but every of this is a story of human. And I'm not in the most vulnerable position, but every family in Bangladesh, once in there, elderly people, a young person, have this heaviness in our heart, and which is as Professor Farhana Sultana likes to put it, another Bangladesh amazing scholar, as a climate coloniality. This is constantly rebuilding, that perpetuating the colonial violence into countries like Bangladesh, like Pacifica, and other smaller climate vulnerable countries was contributed very less. And I will stop share so Ruchira can share her slide, and so I can sum up the key messages from Bangladesh if I can. But also want to acknowledge a final thing, that it's very difficult when putting in a position to talk for 173 million people. It's just kind of reiterating what the work they have been doing. So I think 4 key messages, if I can, on behalf of many in my country and community, would say, it's a small, low-lying coastal country, constantly at the forefront of the crisis, constantly getting battered by cyclones, sea level rise, floods, and now heat waves as well. And we have one of the lowest per capita carbon emission. So we didn't cause this fire, as I'd like to say. So despite all this, we have developed a par excellence local-led, women-centric climate adaptation methods and practices, despite our very limited resources in the beginning, and which are also getting much limited than before because of the constant pressure we are under with the disasters and the financial losses that happens with each disaster. So it's not just about the loss and damage funding. Countries like Bangladesh, we need climate reparation. The reparation, because those countries like Australia, who are historically responsible for this, they need to, and the fossil fuel corporations, those dodgy ones, need to start pay up our reparation. That's all I can say. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sadiya. We've had these conversations at many Sapna catch-ups, about experiences growing up with cyclones. But Sadiya, I don't think I've never quite kind of like had a chat like this. So I'm really, at one level, it was very poignant. It was like hearing those experiences, even your personal ones. Like, we both come from middle-class families, and we can afford to give ourselves the protections that we can. So if you folks are aware of the geography of that side, Bengal, the Bay of Bengal, I am Bengali Indian. Sadiya is Bengali Bangladeshi. The partition happened, so these are our histories. But having grown up in the Indian part of Bengal, I myself haven't experienced these kinds of cyclones where we would have to relocate to a cyclone shelter. So just a little further away from where Sadiya has been born and brought up, it's still that significantly different. We don't get battered the way in Calcutta that many coastal places in Bangladesh do. So this for me was quite a realization when you narrated those personal experiences and family experiences also. Thanks for sharing your stories and for taking us through this. So I'm very keen for us to have questions. So I'm going to try and keep this next part as crisp and short as possible. We are producing a briefer, which we'll put out next week. And it has some key messages. These are some of them. And what you can do, this was intended as a first information session on Bangladesh by us, Sapna, to the Australian climate movement. We realized that, sorry, I'm going to try. Go to the next screen. We realized that while there rightly is a lot of focus on the Pacific Island countries, the first thing we needed to do as Sapna to start talking about Australia and Australia's climate responsibilities towards South Asia was to be able to tell the Australian climate movement that it is not just small island vulnerable countries, it's also small vulnerable countries in the global south. And many South Asian countries, such as Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, actually do fit that picture in terms of what Australia should directly be thinking of doing in terms of climate cooperation, much more than it is. But before we did that, before we launched into that, this is what Sapna does. We tell stories. We wanted you to know the story of Bangladesh, and Sadiya has brought that personal experience along with her research. And we move on from here. So this bit is really brief. What we haven't been able to start yet, which is going to be very long drawn and specific in terms of research areas, and Sapna is, some of you might know, is literally a one-person team, which is me. And I get some fantastic freelance support for research and communications from time to time. Sadiya came in to do this piece of research. So thanks, Sadiya. So basically, what we haven't been able to do is consider the specific ways in which we will start articulating Australia's climate responsibilities towards Bangladesh. But what we are doing is making the case here about why Bangladesh matters for Australia's climate actions. So if we consider the climate vulnerability of Bangladesh, and we look at the language of the Australian government, you might have seen in the news that Australia provided humanitarian relief of $1.8 million after the devastating Bangladesh floods. Australia talks about taking real and ambitious climate action to address climate change at home and in the Indo-Pacific region. So basically, Australia also is working with Bangladesh, it says, to be someone who will help Bangladesh bring their best practices in local climate adaptation to the Pacific Islands. So Australia is playing a certain role in the region. But what is interesting is that there are obvious omissions. So Sadiya mentioned, or maybe we didn't have too much time to get into this in the infographic that she showed. Australia supports the Global Loss and Damage Fund, but Australia has not made a contribution to the Global Loss and Damage Fund. Most of Australia's climate finance is focused on the Pacific. But the contribution to the Global Loss and Damage Fund would mean that that kind of fund and that kind of money could come through to places like Bangladesh. So there is research on the table, which is done by quite a few of you who are in the room today. In fact, you are the experts and we are not. So basically, there is work by Oxfam. There is work by 50 Australian groups, including Kana, ActionAid, et cetera. There's also work by Market Forces. Basically, what are the very obvious omissions if we try to think of Australia's climate cooperation and climate responsibilities towards a small, vulnerable South Asian country like Bangladesh? So first of all, Australia continues to export coal and gas. As the very latest report from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty pointed out. It does not contribute its fair share of climate finance. It also is contributing to fossil fuel expansion in Bangladesh. In various ways, also through aid funding that is directed towards fossil fuel projects that go through the multilateral development banks. And it has been silent on contributing to the global loss and damage. So basically, these things, some of you here know better than us. You've been working on this. What I want to leave you with is about, so we tried in this presentation to bring you the story of Bangladesh, a historical journey of Bangladesh's growing climate resilience leadership, which gets overwhelmed from time to time in the face of massive climate events, such as the floods you saw. So the death tolls really rise, whereas Bangladesh had been taking action to actually reduce the casualties cyclone by cyclone. What Australia needs to consider and what we want to leave you climate groups with are certain possibilities. Why does Bangladesh matter for Australia's climate action? Because it is enabled the same logic as the Pacific Islands holds in many ways to South Asian neighbors in the Indo-Pacific. Also, the climate vulnerability extends beyond small island countries. So it's also the language and framing and perspective of the climate groups themselves in Australia, which need to accommodate other possibilities of Australia's cooperation and climate responsibilities beyond small island countries, because that's also equally critical. The other point, which the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty report brought out, making the case of we all being part of the Commonwealth. South Asia, with its colonial past, is Bangladesh's part of the Commonwealth, like Australia. So climate responsibility towards another vulnerable Commonwealth nation. And the other point, which Australia in its messaging keeps harping on, deepening economic ties in the South Asian region. South Asia is critical economically for Australia today and into the future. So Australia has climate responsibilities towards vulnerable countries there and about helping them set up safe climate futures. So these are the statistics that the Bangladesh government's talking about in terms of the number of people who will be displaced due to climate change by 2050. The other thing we need to consider in Australia, something that the Australian climate movement is very uncomfortable with, but we are heading towards a catastrophic climate events if business as usual continues. Bangladesh has a large diaspora. I'm going to move to this. Bangladesh has a large and growing, Australia has a large and growing Bangladeshi diaspora. They would find it relevant for Australia in the global north to take action and take responsibilities towards Bangladesh, because they have the experience of climate change both in Bangladesh and Australia. So we wanted to leave you with making the case about why Bangladesh would matter for Australia's climate actions. So these are the other final key messages which relate to Australia's climate actions towards South Asia and Bangladesh. You can just take a photo of the slide if you like, or wait for the briefer to come out next week. I'll just take the slide down now after just telling you this. Yeah.